Ravenmoor Manor was the kind of place people only spoke about in hushed tones. It had been abandoned for years, perched at the edge of a forgotten town, its grand Gothic architecture crumbling and overtaken by ivy. Stories circulated about the place, of strange happenings, eerie sightings, and the ghostly presence that was said to stalk the manor's halls. No one dared to step inside, until one group of young thrill-seekers decided to spend the night there, seeking to uncover the truth. But what they found was beyond their worst nightmares. The manor had once been the home of the Ravenswood family, an affluent but mysterious family that had disappeared under strange circumstances nearly a century ago. The town's whispers hinted at curses, tragic deaths, and the dark arts, but no one knew for sure. When the dare was set for the young group, Elena, Mark, Tom, and Sophie, they jumped at the chance to spend the night, armed with flashlights, cameras, and a sense of adventure. They laughed off the stories as superstition, unaware that the shadows had already begun to stir, watching, waiting. The air was thick as they entered, each step echoing through the empty halls. Dust clung to the dark wood, and cobwebs veiled the chandeliers. The deeper they went, the more the atmosphere seemed to close in, like unseen eyes tracking their every move. Elena noticed faint scratches on the walls, words barely visible in the dim light. "Do not enter. Leave." And the name Lillian, repeated over and over. As she ran her fingers over the jagged letters, a shiver ran down her spine, and she felt as though something were breathing down her neck. Hours passed, and strange things began to happen. The sounds of footsteps echoed above them, though the floorboards were thick with dust, untouched by human feet for years. They heard whispers coming from the rooms they hadn't entered yet, voices that sounded like a woman's, calling a name, Lillian, over and over, growing more insistent. The group was nervous, but decided to press on, determined to debunk the so-called haunting and prove their bravery. But every corner they turned seemed darker, colder, as though the manor itself wanted them lost. Finally, they reached what the townspeople called the mirror room. It was a grand chamber lined with antique mirrors, each one cracked, dusty, yet reflecting the group's faces in strange, distorted ways. Eleanor stepped forward, entranced by a large mirror in the center that had an unusual, dark aura. As she stared, the air around her grew colder, and her reflection changed. Her eyes turned hollow, her skin pale, her mouth twisted into a sinister grin. She screamed and stumbled back, breaking her gaze, but the image in the mirror lingered for a moment longer, as if it had a mind of its own. Mark, who had been filming the whole time, decided to check his footage. When he played it back, the group went pale. Behind them, in the darkness, a figure could be seen, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face obscured, standing still and watching them from the shadows. But in the footage, every time they looked back, she disappeared, only to reappear a little closer each time. Panic set in. "We need to leave," Sophie whispered, clutching Mark's arm. But the doors, which had been left open, were now locked tight, as though the manor had decided they would stay. Their night became a nightmare. They split up in a desperate search for a way out, but as they wandered, the halls seemed to change around them, leading them in circles. Tom heard a soft crying sound and followed it, finding a small, dark room where a woman's ghostly form was crouched, weeping. Her face lifted to reveal hollow, black eyes, and she whispered, "Lillian, come back to me." He stumbled back, tripping and crawling out, but the shadow followed him, slowly, deliberately, as if savoring his fear. In a last act of desperation, Elena remembered the name scratched into the walls. She called out, "Lillian, if you're here, we mean you no harm." The air grew thick, heavy, and for a moment, everything fell silent. Then, a faint voice replied, "Leave, while you can." The group regrouped, and with renewed strength, forced the doors open, bursting into the cold night air. As they looked back, they saw her, Lillian's spirit, standing in the window, her hollow eyes watching as they fled. The group returned to town, but none spoke of what happened in Ravenmoor Manor. Their cameras and footage captured things they couldn't explain, but they left the tapes untouched, too afraid to relive that night. And to this day, Ravenmoor Manor stands silent, waiting for the next visitor foolish enough to disturb its shadows. They say Lillian is still there, bound to the manor by a dark force, calling for the daughter she lost, ready to trap anyone who dares enter. Some places should remain forgotten, and some spirits never rest. So if you ever find yourself near Ravenmoor Manor, listen closely. You might just hear her calling, Lillian. And if you do, don't turn back, because once she sees you, you may never escape.